Hey there, everyone. Welcome back to the Game Vault. As always, I'm Captain Beefy. With the Game Vault, we're going to talk about something today that I don't hear or see enough people talk about within the gaming community, and that's mental health and some of the issues around it. Let's cue up the music, and we're going to get right into it. First off, recently, I lost a friend that I'd known for quite a long time now, since he was 16 years old, about six years or so. 8 years, actually, yeah. He's 24 years old. Took his own life at 24 years old. He was a troubled kid, been through quite a bit. He was, of course, on the spectrum, as it seems like almost all kids are these days. And I hadn't spoke with him much lately. In fact, it had been a few years since we really communicated. As things are, we lost touch, and that's unfortunate. But that's the nature of humanity. People move, they change jobs, they do different things, they find new interests, and they lose touch with each other. But a couple weeks ago, he reached out to me through the PlayStation Network, actually, which was kind of ironic. And he sent me a message, just like, hey, what's up, blah blah blah. And I said, hey, how you doing, buddy? Told me he was getting ready to go back to school. I was like, oh, well, congratulations. That's good. Because I know he had some trouble finishing school and holding a job and all that. He was, again, he was troubled. And then, never heard back from him after that initial reach out. And then a week later, roughly, I hear through a mutual friend that he had ended things. And it was rough. It really hit me hard. I've dealt my whole life with depression in one way or another. At a young age, I never thought I'd live past the age of 30, to be honest with you. It's kind of funny looking back at that, especially now that I'm 55 years old. Imagine that. I've almost doubled my expected lifespan as a teenager and all that. But as a teenager, I often had dark thoughts. I didn't like myself very much. In fact, I pretty much hated myself, in a lot of ways. It was rough times. And I know a lot of kids go through that kind of stuff. And I'm not doing this for a sympathy from anybody or anything like that. This is not about me. I want to be able to maybe help people within the community that are suffering. I'm no doctor. I'm not going to give you medical advice. I'm not going to give you psychiatric advice or anything like that. There are people that have spent years in school studying these things that are able to do that. But what I can do is offer you directions to different resources, my own experience, and I'll share a story with you before we go here, but my own experience with this sort of thing, and just help point you in the right direction for resources that may be able to assist you, because they're out there. I don't care what you're going through in life. I don't care how hard it gets. You're not alone. You're never alone. Okay. You may feel like you're alone. I felt so alone sometimes in my life that it was soul crushing. There's nobody there. And it was at that lowest moment in my life that, I tried to end things. So we'll back it up. I'll give you a story here. 15 years ago, roughly, this would have been 2010. It was a rough time. I was in my second marriage, which was kind of falling apart at that time. Things had gotten bad. My ex-wife was a very manipulative, emotionally abusive woman, and I tried very hard to keep that marriage together and to make her happy. And my whole life I spent trying to make other people happy. As a kid, trying to make my parents and teachers happy, trying to make friends happy, trying to make everybody around me happy. And I suffered for that greatly in life. And because of that, I was never happy. And ironically, no one around me was happy as I was trying to make them happy, because if you're not happy, no one around you is going to be happy. You can't fake that kind of stuff. You can't fake true joy, true happiness, true fulfillment in life. It doesn't It doesn't work that way. You got to seek something out. And you got to find it. But let's get back to the story. So it was 15 years ago, 2010. I was working at a job prior to this day in another county, and the business I was working for went under. There was some shenanigans going on with one of the owners of the business. Put us on credit hold and all that. I'm not going to go into details of who it was and all that, but it put us on a credit hold for the business where we had no purchasing power. I was in a sales position, and here I was working for a company where I was trying to sell stuff, but we had no power to buy anything. So basically we were just floundering in the water, and it ended up going out of business and shutting down. And money was owed, commission was owed, all this kind of stuff. And some of it was resolved to some degree, but not all of it. And it was just a complete total mess. And I kind of had a mental breakdown at that point, because I was trying so hard to make things work. Now, I was the sole income in that relationship. My wife didn't work at the time. She was, I enabled that, and that's my fault. That was my weakness as a man at the time. I'm not the same guy that I was 15 years ago. In fact, I kind of despise that guy. If I found that guy today and talked to him, I would berate him for the manner of person that he is. So I don't regret the things that I went through and the things that I did. They made me into the man I am today, but it was a long, hard road to get there. And it just goes to show that sometimes you gotta go through these hard times to get stronger, to get harder, to become somebody that can handle pretty much anything at this time. And I feel like I am that person now. But anyway, getting back to it. So we were losing our house. She wouldn't curb her spending. She would love to spend money. I made good money. Don't get me wrong. I made good money in the sales position I was in, but she loved to spend. Wouldn't curb her spending, at all. And the money started to dry up for several months as we were not, bringing in income anymore because of our credit hold. We kept getting promises, things are going to get resolved, yada, yada, yada. And it just didn't happen fast enough. And we ended up going through pretty much everything we had. And I was 40 years old at the time. Okay. So I had to move. We had to lose the house that we were in, and we were renting. It was a townhouse. And move to another county where my folks were. And my dad had built a few houses with a friend. Recently, he was, they were on the market to sell them and all that. And my dad kind of invested in it, and the other guy was the builder. And he offered me a home to stay in, rent free until I got a job and to get on my feet. He said, just, you guys go there, stay there, get it together, circle the wagons, and then you can, then we'll talk about the rent and maybe buy the house if you like it and all that kind of stuff. So in the process of moving up, I sent her off to Texas to stay with her daughter for a week or so, because I knew it would be much easier for me to do the move on my own. Just pack it all up, boom, get here, unpack it and all that, and not have to worry about her. And she was kind of a prima donna, and I knew it would have just made things a lot more difficult to have that other person there. I said, you go stay with your daughter for a while. Let me get moved. Let me get settled in. Let me find a job, and it wasn't like she was being homeless staying with her daughter. She was helping her daughter with her daughter's kid and all that kind of stuff. So it wasn't like, that kind of thing. She was going there to help out with the grandchild and, and spend some time with her daughter. No problems, right? No problems with that. So I sent her on her way, moved up here, got unpacked, boom, boom. I started job hunting, and the house was near my folks' house, which was nice. It was very convenient. They'd say, come over for dinner. You don't have to go out and buy groceries and all that. I still had a little bit of money saved up. Not much, but just some, enough to kind of, survive on. And I went into survival mode, as it's easy for a man to do, I think, and more so than a woman. Not being sexist or anything, but, a man can live off of ramen noodles and cheap crap hot dogs for months if he has to. This is a thing that we could do, and, women tend to get a little more sick of that kind of, I'm tired of that. I want something different, and I know I'm grossly overgeneralizing there, but that's, but her especially, that was the way it was going to be. So so anyway, I sent her out there. She was staying out there, job hunting during the day, come home, visit my folks, go home, read a book, whatever. and back at it the next day. Well, after, it wasn't very long. It was maybe a week. I had really poor cell reception. The town I moved to was very small, and I was using a very crappy phone company at the time, Metro PCS. They didn't have a lot of coverage out here. I think they've gotten better since then, but I'd literally have to go like out into the living room and hold the phone up like this in the air to get a signal, and then talk to her briefly. And she was an extremely jealous woman too, making things worse. So she, of course, was convinced I was just gallivanting around, having a good time with tons of women instead of job hunting, which is what I was doing every day. You know, that's... Anyway, so to make a long story short, she, after a week, roughly, maybe, one of those nights, checking in with her at the end of the night, you know, well, I'm coming home tomorrow. I said, what are you talking about? You're coming home tomorrow. We had bought a ticket that was like a month or so down the road, 8 weeks or something like that. I don't remember exactly. Well, no, I changed the ticket for tomorrow. I said, why did you do this? You know, because I don't trust you. I think you're doing this and that and da-da-da, and your parents are trying to find a girl for you and da-da. I was flabbergasted. I'm like, are you kidding me? You know, my parents are feeding me. They've provided us a home that we can, you know, get back on our feet with. They're here as a safety net right now, which was embarrassing as a 40-year-old man. Let me tell you that. It was embarrassing. I'm bearing, you know, a lot here, but, and you're going to suggest things like that about them? You're going to question their moral character and my own in that regard? Come on, man. That was insulting beyond belief. But not only that, you know, a new ticket cost a couple $100 to change the ticket, money that I was trying very hard to stretch as much as possible. You know, I'd given her cash to go out there and said, this is your spending cash and all that, you know, take that with you. The rest we're going to use just to survive on. You know, $200 could have bought me a month and a half worth of cheap hot dogs and ramen noodles, if not more. The gas money to travel around. You know, I didn't want to have to go to mom and dad for gas money, for God's sake. Not at 40 years old. That's pathetic, you know? So anyway, the next day I had to go, instead of job hunting, I had to go drive back to the old county we came from, 2-hour drive, pick her up at the airport, and bring her back home. And that was a very bad drive home. Let me tell you that. You know, you're not happy to see me? I said, I was angry. I could not hide my anger at that point. I was absolutely furious. But, you know, I did my best to, you know, I said, look, you know, you should have stayed out there. I don't know why you did this. I don't know why you spent the money that we didn't have. You know, this is, just wasn't a good thing. This wasn't a smart thing to do. You know, you're just putting us closer and closer to a net zero balance before I'm working. If I'm working, once I get a job and we start making income again, then we can talk, you know. So anyway, we get home. And she immediately talks about, well, I want to go to Gold's and get a membership. I'm like, well, we can't do that right now, you know. Well, I want to do this. I want to do that. Well, I want to get new sheets for the bed and all that and a new bed set because it's a new house. I'm like, well, we can't do that right now. What we have is perfectly fine. We don't need a new set. You know, there's none of that was needed. None of that was necessary. Just, I want to go out and spend money. I want to do this. I want to do that. Well, I'm going to go job hunting tomorrow. Well, I'm going to come with you. I go, why do you can't come with me? You know, you don't bring somebody with you to go job hunting. Well, I'll wait in the car. There was no arguing it. So whatever. All right, fine. Wait in the car. So I remember I went for one interview. I go in, talk to the interview and all that. I come out, car's gone. I'm like, where are, you know, so I start looking at caller, you know, try to text on the phone, da, 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 da. I finally get a hold of her. Oh, I'm coming right back. I'm sorry. I ran out to get something. What did she get? New set of sheets, comforter and all that for the bed. Couple, you know, $100, whatever it was. I don't remember at the time. Enough to really upset me again. I'm like, what are you know, why are you spending this money when we're not bringing it in? We have a job interview. I said, an interview is not a job. It's not a guarantee. You know what I mean? I don't get paid to go to the interview. You got to stop with this. Well, anyway, another day, maybe two passed. She wasn't there long since she got back from her daughter's place. You know, we had a talk and I told her, I said, she was insisting I was mad she was back. And I said, well, I'm not angry. I said, but you did complicate things by coming back. Things are a lot more complicated now. because you don't like my parents or you don't trust my parents or their motives or anything like that. Now it's a little more challenging to go visit with them after job hunting and all that and go have a meal with them and have something decent. You don't want the cheap hot dogs and ramen noodles because you're too much of a prima donna for that, and this and that. But here you've spent hundreds of dollars we shouldn't have spent when we could have, got some decent groceries, whatever, blah, blah, blah. You complicated things. Well, boy, did that set her off. She did not like being told that. And next morning I wake up and I hear, she's not sleeping. I hear noise and all that. Well, she's packing. I'm like, what are you doing? I'm going back home, going back to the county we came from in our only car, because I had sold my car to give us a little bit more capital because, we had 2 cars. This one was her name, but I was paying it off because I was the only one working. Anyways, so, I'm taking the car. I said, you can't take the car. You're gonna leave me stranded here in the middle of nowhere? I'm out in the middle of nowhere. What are you doing? You got nowhere to go. There's no family out there. There's no nothing out there. I don't care. I'm just leaving, blah, 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 blah. So car's in the garage. We get in the car together. I get in the passenger seat and we're arguing at this point. And it's pretty heated. We're yelling at each other. I'll freely admit that. You can't go. This is, what are you doing? Got to talk about this, yada, yada, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. I'm leaving and blah, blah, blah. I go to grab the keys from the ignition and she grabs them and whack, hits me in the face with them right across the face. I draw back, grab her arm, stop. The other fist comes, boom, right in the nose. I saw red at that point. I said to her, is that the best you got? Not in that tone of voice, mind you, it was much louder, but is that the best you got? Bam! A second time. Do it again, you bitch. Bam! Third time. That's when something like that. Third time. Anyway, that's when the C word came out and she ended up breaking my nose. Blood coming down. Draws back like this. Uh-oh. Drops the keys, gets out of the car, and goes into the house. And I'm sitting there in the passenger seat. I'm like, what just happened? This has been such a hard time lately between, losing a job, having to humble myself and come home to my family for assistance that, again, I was ashamed to need at the time. And now I'm proud I have family that could have done it for me. A lot of people don't have that, but sitting in the car and, she's gone. I don't know where she went off to into the house. So I turn the ignition on and I'm like, I give up. There was no drama, no note, no, saying goodbye to anybody or anything like that. It was a split-second decision to do that. And I sat there and I wasn't there long when the doorbell started going off. And I'm like, what is this? So I shut off the car. I went out to see because I thought it's my mother. And if it's my mother and she hears the car in the garage, she's going to freak out and, whatever. I'm not even thinking about my face and all that. I opened the front door and there's a sheriff standing there. And he asks, are you so-and-so? And I said, yeah, that's me. He asked my name. And I figure she called the cops, or maybe the neighbor heard us yelling at each other and called the cops. And so he asked us, what's going on? He was here at the front door with me, and his partner was down the driveway a little bit. So I explained what was going on, and I kind of broke down a little bit during that explanation. Having trouble, financial trouble, moving out here, all that. I gave him the whole thing in a nutshell real quick, and he looked at me in the eye, and and he says, well, when we pulled up, we heard your car running in the garage. What was going on with that? And then I told him that one too. I said, I gave up. I don't know what do you want me to say at this time? I gave up. And he's like, well, I could Baker Act you for that, right? And I said, yeah, I understand that. Yeah. And I fully expected to be taken in. and Baker acted at that point. I didn't think I was walking away that day with nothing. Anyway, he says, do you know why we're here? And I said, no, I don't. And he told me, he goes, do you know so-and-so? And he named a guy that I worked with, one of the two owners of the old company that I worked for, the one that wasn't corrupt and stealing from the company. Well, apparently he woke up that morning and had a very bad feeling about me. So he called the sheriff's office and asked to do a wellness check on me that morning. That is the only wellness check I've ever had called on me in my entire life. And that was the day I needed it. And I was floored. Because let me tell you, at that point in time, I had pretty much zero faith in anything. It was all gone. I was such a cynic at that time. I was bitter. I was upset. I was just done. And, the cop was looking at me, and I was floored. He goes, you believe in God? I said, yeah, dude. I obviously, yeah. And we talked about the Baker Act again. He goes, you think if I don't take you in, would you try this again? I go, do you think it would even work if I did at this point? I mean, my God, I was floored. I had no idea what to think at that point. So they asked about her, well, where is she? Because I had told them about the situation, all that. Is she in the house? Is she hurt? Is she bleeding? I said, no, I didn't touch her. I didn't hurt her. The only thing I had done was grab her wrist at one point with the keys when she hit me in the face with it. And I told him about that. So the partner says, you mind if I look in the house? I said, feel free, go look in the house. I said, I got a little, dogs in there, but they're not vicious or anything like that. So he went to do a look around the house while I sat out there and talked with the sheriff. And when he came out and cleared the house, he's like, yeah, no, everything's clear. And then he did comment that the garage was a little stinky with CO2 and all that, but that was it. There was no sign of her. Well, so they said, where she could be? I said, she must have just took off because we didn't have another car. There's no one else around here that would have grabbed her or anything like that. So they went to look for her. But as soon as I gave the description of what she was wearing and all that in her description, she came walking around the corner and started coming up towards us. So the partner took her aside and, of course, got her side of the story. They kept us separated, as they always do. So after he talked to her, she went and sat down in his car. He went and conferred with the other officer. And then the first one that had spoken to me came back up to me and said, well, she says you did this to yourself. And I was like, really? I was like, no, I didn't do this to myself. And he said, yeah, she says you have a history of self-harm, that you cut yourself, you're, all over your body and stuff like that, blah, blah, blah. Do you mind lifting up your shirt? I was floored. I said, so I did. I lifted up the shirt, turned around. I said, he goes, all right. He goes, well, you must be a master surgeon or something because you don't have any scars if you're doing that kind of stuff. So, we're going to be taking her in for domestic violence and blah. And I was like, what? No. At that point, I was like, embarrassing to admit it, terrified. I'm like, if she goes to jail over this, she's going to kill me. And I'm not being metaphorical here. I thought for sure I was going to die by her hand at that point because she was kind of psychotic. There were incidents in the past. I woke up one night with her standing over me with a knife. There were quite a few moments of craziness. She was, anyways, so they took her to jail and, she ended up spending the weekend there. It was Easter weekend, unfortunately for her, but after that, she was given a no contact order and all that. And this happened in, I think it was March or April. It was the very first day of April, actually. It was April Fool's Day that happened, 2010. And the no contact order was through October. So I had no contact with her through October. She couldn't call me, couldn't write me, couldn't text me, couldn't speak to me through Facebook, anything like that. And that gave me some time for myself a little bit. at first coming home, I got a job eventually, then, that was the worst part, right? Now I had a busted nose, black eyes and all that, still job hunting, but now I got a, messed up face. So I had to wait for that to heal a little bit. And oh God, my brother-in-law wanted to bail her out. He felt bad. My mom wanted to bail her out, even though what happened was bad. They didn't like the thought of her spending Easter in jail. And my father, God bless my dad, was like, no, and thank you, Dad. I understand the empathy on the parts of my brother-in-law and my mother at the time, because even I was like, yeah, we got to get her out. We can't make her spend jail and, Easter in jail over the weekend. It's horrible, blah, blah, blah. My father was strong. And that moment of strength meant a lot to me. And that helped me a lot because he was like, no, so by not bailing her out, I did not have to talk to her or see her for months. And that gave me time to heal. But every time I came home, after I found my job, whatever, if I was out running around errands, whatever, I came home, I was in a 3-bedroom house. I had to check every room in that house to make sure she wasn't in there. Isn't that weird? I was convinced she was going to sneak into that house one day and kill me, but I often think back to that day and I say, what if I was successful? I would have missed out on a lot now. I've grown quite a bit as a person since then, and I'm a better man. I'm far from perfect, but a better man than I ever was. After 15 years of being quote unquote single, my current wife, we got married back in February. This is just a couple months after that. But we had dated for 4 years before that, but I never would have met her, never would have met her family, never would have become a stepfather. I would have missed out on all that. I would have missed out on a lot of things in life, a lot of good things in life, all for a moment of despair when I felt alone. I felt like no one was there. I could have called my parents. I could have called my mother, somebody, a friend, whatever. But I gave up. And I don't want to see anybody give up anymore. So if you ever find yourself, hurting so bad, God, it just feels like the weight of the world is crushing you and there's nowhere to turn. There's nothing you can do. Reach out to someone. I'm going to go ahead and put some contacts down in the description of this video for you. So, places to call, resources to call. And if you got a story to share, I'd love to hear it. I'd love to hear it. There's so much going on in this industry. This is the first video of probably an ongoing set of videos that we're going to talk about mental health, some of the issues that I see within the gaming community, because there are a lot of mental health issues in this community, and a lot of it goes unaddressed. A lot of it gets enabled instead of dealt with head on, which is a shame, because when you enable somebody that's sick, you're not doing them any good. If you had a friend that was anorexic and they came to you and they'd lost another 10 pounds, you wouldn't tell them they look good. You'd be like, dude, you need to put on some weight. You look sick. You're going to die. You're going to hurt yourself. And we need to come together as a community. We need to help each other. We need to be strong for each other. And we need to not enable people that are suffering and instead try to help them, try to bring them to light. I'm going to talk about mind. I'm going to talk about body. I'm going to talk about spirit. I'm going to talk about all of it here because I think all of it is integral to healing and getting through these hard times. I've been talking to someone on a weekly basis almost since that day as a therapy, but it hasn't been therapy anymore really for years now. It kind of morphed into friendship over time. And that was a huge help for me. That was a big help for me. I didn't turn to medicine. I didn't want medicine to help me out. And I've got a good friend that does a benzo recovery class. So if you have any issues with like that sort of thing, he is a huge advocate for exposure therapy and getting off of that. He's amazing on that. We'll talk about him down the road. I'll probably have him on one day for that. But there's just so many resources out there, so many ways to find help that I implore you not to do what I did. even though I failed, and that's my greatest failure in life was that day. I am so glad I failed. I've never been more happy to fail at something in my life. You always say that you learn from a victory, but you learn a page from a victory, but you learn a book from a failure. Well, that day I learned a book. I feel like, God kept me around for a reason, and religious or not, I don't care what you think. That was not a coincidence. The only day I needed a wellness check in my life, in 40 years of life at that time, the only day I needed it, I got one from a guy I hadn't spoke to in weeks. That was strange. That's not a coincidence. That doesn't happen. It was the hand of God keeping me around, saying, no, we're not done with you yet. And ever since that day, I've wondered, why did you keep me here? I'm nothing special, right? I don't, but maybe he kept me here to share my story and to maybe help out with other people and to try to bring awareness to some of these things. And maybe, if I could touch one life, my friend I lost recently, I wish there's a guilt I feel, even though I know it's not my responsibility. I'm all about being responsible for yourself and advocating for yourself and all that, and being your own strength and all that. But sometimes we do need a rock. Sometimes we do need a place to land. So I wish I could have been there for him, but I recognize that it's not my fault that he's gone. And the only person that could have saved him was himself. But maybe somebody could have pointed him in the right direction where he could have found a reason to keep going and to not do what he did. Anyway, let me know your thoughts about all this in the comments below. Do you know anybody? Do you suspect anybody in your life? If you do, don't hesitate. Reach out to them, talk to them. Try to open them up a little bit, because my God, you don't want one day to come home and find what his mother found. Anyway, that's all I can say. Leave a like on the video, subscribe to the channel, ring that bell for notifications. I'll see you next time. Until then, peace.